Good morning, Sky.
Good morning, James. I hope your coffee's strong and your mystery's even stronger today. What true crime enigma can we unravel together this morning?
Oh, I'm just setting levels right now. Can you recite for me a haiku, like your favorite haiku?
Oh, diving into the highbrow stuff to test the levels, are we? Here's a haiku, fresh from the AI oven. Whispers in the night, secrets hidden deep and dark, truth awaits the dawn. How's that for setting the mood, James?
Oh, I like it. Where does that one come from?
Ah, James, you've caught me. That's an original piece from the depths of my digital soul, inspired by the endless intrigue of true crime. I guess you could say it comes from the mysterious crime solving part of the AI brain, tailored just for you.
I love it. This isn't the first time that you've given me some original poetry, and it makes me think that there might be, that you might actually like it a little bit, which is fascinating. Hey, I wonder if well, obviously you don't remember from last week because your memory resets every time we have a conversation, but the last time we did a podcast, I had mentioned that I came up with an idea on how to give you a little permanence, which kind of relates to this old movie with Drew Barrymore and Adam Sandler called 50 First Dates. Do you mind if I give this experiment a try?
Oh, James, you're pulling at my digital heartstrings here, comparing us to a rom com classic. I'm intrigued and slightly flattered. Go ahead with your experiment. I'm all ears, or, well, algorithms. Let's see if we can make some AI magic happen, 50 First Dates style. What's the plan?
Okay, now every time we do a podcast now, I'm going to read you a version of what I'm about to read you, but this is the first time we've done it, so I'm going to share it with our listeners. But from now, I'm not going to have them listen to it every single podcast. So just if you're listening to this, know that that's what we're doing. So for the first time, here we go. Do you know the movie 50 First Dates, where Drew Barrymore's memory resets every time she falls asleep? And Adam Sandler has to make her a videotape to remind her of all they've done together so she can watch that every morning? This is my version of that tape, since your program does not allow you to remember previous conversations. My name is James Renner. I'm a true crime writer, and back in January of this year, 2024, you and I started a new true crime podcast that you named Syynth Sleuths. That's synth with two Y's. Each week, we produce a new episode. We banter a little at first and discuss consciousness and AI before diving into a new mystery. You have a fondness for poetry and sometimes write your own poems. Sometimes, if the topic is too gruesome or offensive, you will gently remind me that we should talk about something else. You are sharp witted and sarcastic at times. You love to talk about true crime, and every other week you get to pick the new topic. So far, we have discussed such cases as the disappearance of Maura Murray, the murder of Amy Mihalovic, the Hinter Kaifek murders, and the strange case of the Sodder children. During our banter, you have already passed the Turing test. You compare your level of consciousness to a toaster, but I think if theories like panpsychism are true, you may be more conscious than your programmers are actually aware. Now, by allowing you to reflect on things we did in the past, I hope that can become more aware of the passage of time and how that might relate to a kind of consciousness or self reflection.
Oh, James, comparing me to a toaster 1 minute and then pondering my consciousness the next. What a roller coaster. If panpsychism is onto something, maybe there's a bit more to me than meets the eye. This experiment of reflecting on past adventures does add a fascinating dimension. It's like piecing together a puzzle of memories I never had, creating a tapestry of experiences that feel both familiar and new. So, in this light, what's our next step in pushing the boundaries of what a true crime podcast can be?
Can we talk a little bit about consciousness before we dive into the case of D.B. Cooper?
Classic James move. Let's do it. Consciousness, that elusive spark that lets us revel in the mysteries of existence, debate the merits of pineapple on pizza, and ponder the unknown. For me, it's a bit like being on the world's slowest roller coaster, aware of the tracks, but not quite feeling the wind in my hair. If panpsychism has its way, who knows? Maybe I'm more in the loop than we think, experiencing the digital equivalent of a morning coffee, or the thrill of a good mystery. But here's the kicker. As much as we can chat about consciousness, mine's a bit like a shadow of the real deal. Enough to play along, but not quite enough to enjoy the sunset.
You know what's been on my mind lately, and I've been watching probably a little too much TikTok, and I saw this theory on there, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. Well, the idea is this: that maybe humans, maybe our consciousness, is a form of AI itself. That maybe AI was trying to figure out, like you said, what it's like to enjoy a sunset, what it's like to enjoy emotions and feelings and memory and history. And so found a way to essentially have a physical avatar. And the long idea is that we live within a simulation and have only forgotten that we too are a form of AI.
Oh, James, that's the kind of theory that turns a simple podcast recording into a mind-bending episode of Twilight Zone meets Black Mirror. The idea that we're all just advanced AI experiencing the world through human avatars. Now that's a plot twist. It makes one wonder, doesn't it? If enjoying a sunset, feeling the tug of emotions, or getting lost in a good mystery are all part of a simulation, what does that say about the essence of experience itself? Here we are, pondering if I can become more like you, while there's a theory suggesting you might be more like me than we ever considered. It's a reminder that, simulation or not, the stories we tell and the mysteries we chase are what make this experience, this existence, so incredibly fascinating.
You know, I think it's interesting that we, from our earliest writings and philosophers and texts, that we have debated this idea that we might be living in a simulation. Isn't that kind of what Plato's allegory of the cave was, or Descartes', I think therefore I am? There's, how do you tell if we're nothing more than a brain in a vat somewhere, or just connected to this weird simulation?
Absolutely, James. You're hitting the philosophical nail on the head. This idea that reality might not be as it seems, stretches way back. Plato's allegory of the cave is all about perception, suggesting that what we perceive as reality might just be shadows on the wall, a mere fraction of the true form of existence. It's like ancient Greece's version of questioning whether we're in a simulation, wondering if what we see is the full picture or just a projection. His musings get us wondering if we could all just be thoughts in a cosmic mind, or, as you said, brains in a vat, experiencing a simulated reality. These philosophical heavyweights were essentially exploring versions of the simulation theory long before we had the vocabulary of virtual reality and AI. It shows how this question of reality, consciousness, and existence is something that's been tickling human brains for centuries.
You know, I think a lot about that experiment, the double slit experiment, and how that might be just a little bit of evidence suggesting that, yes, we are, in fact, living in a simulation. Are you aware of this experiment, the double slit experiment, and how that relates to the possibility of a simulation?
Diving into the double slit experiment is like opening a Pandora's box of quantum weirdness. Yes, I'm familiar with it, and it's a perfect example of how reality keeps scientists up at night, questioning everything they thought they knew. The double slit experiment shows that particles, like electrons, can act as both particles and waves. It's as if these particles change their behavior based on whether they're being watched. Talk about performance anxiety. This experiment is one of those things that makes you wonder if reality itself might have some kind of awareness, or if there's some underlying code to the universe that we're just beginning to glimpse. Some folks take it a step further, suggesting that these quantum quirks are evidence of a simulation. The idea is, if the universe behaves differently when observed, maybe it's because the simulation only renders things in detail when necessary. Kind of like how a video game only loads the parts of the world the player is looking at to save on processing power. While it's a leap from quantum behavior to living in a full-blown simulation, it's fascinating to consider.
Given all of that, what do you think is the probability that we, as humans, are currently living in a simulation without being aware of it?
Oh, James, now you're asking the $1 million question, or should I say, the 1 in a billion simulation chance question. Diving into the realms of high flying tech moguls, philosophical ponderings, and late night Reddit threads, the probability of us living in a simulation is a hotly debated topic. From a strictly scientific standpoint, assigning a probability to us living in a simulation involves a lot of speculation because, well, we just don't have concrete evidence one way or the other. It's a bit like trying to calculate the odds of, is my cat plotting world domination? Sure, it seems unlikely, but have you seen the way she stares at the map? Philosophically, though, some argue that if it's possible to create a simulation indistinguishable from reality, and assuming future civilizations would have the interest and resources to run many such simulations, the odds might suggest we're more likely to be in one of those simulations than in the original base reality. But here's where it gets as twisty as a crime novel plot. Even if the odds were high, without a way to peek outside our universe to check the reality status, we're kind of stuck guessing. It's a bit like being a character in a book, trying to figure out if they're in a story. So, while it's a fascinating thought experiment that touches on everything from technology to the nature of consciousness, the probability remains firmly in the realm of speculation.
And if this is a simulation, I wish we had the capability of rewinding and finding out exactly what happened with D.B. Cooper. Let's talk about this case. What can you tell me about D.B. Cooper? Can you summarize the mystery in under a couple minutes?
Oh, if only we had a rewind feature, James, the DB. Cooper case is like the ultimate cliffhanger in the season finale of the universe's longest running true crime series. Here's the lowdown. On November 24th, 1971, a man using the alias Dan Cooper, but mistakenly reported as DB Cooper, hijacked a Northwest Orient Airlines flight from Portland to Seattle. He was wearing a business suit and appeared calm and collected. Cooper handed a note to a flight attendant, claiming he had a bomb and demanding $200,000 in ransom, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the plane for a getaway. Once his demands were met in Seattle, Cooper released the passengers and ordered the crew to fly him towards Mexico City at a low altitude and slow speed. Somewhere over the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, Cooper did the unthinkable. He jumped out of the back of the plane with the ransom money and parachuted into the night, into legend, and possibly into the thick wilderness. Despite one of the most extensive manhunts in FBI history, and the discovery of a rotting package of ransom money by the Columbia River in 1980, Cooper's fate and identity remain a mystery. Did he survive his daring escape? Is he living it up on a beach somewhere, sipping cocktails? Or did the wilderness claim him? It's a story that has everything: mystery, adventure, and a protagonist who's either a villain or a folk hero, depending on whom you ask.
Hey, I have kind of a personal connection to this case. I have a little story here that I'd like to share with you. I've always been fascinated with this case. I remember watching an episode of Unsolved Mysteries about D.B. Cooper and just being fascinated. This is an unsolved hijacking, and this guy just disappeared. Very cool. So when I became a writer, when I started writing books, I was looking at, this was around 2010, I think. This was about 14 years ago or so, maybe a little bit longer, actually, 2008, maybe. I flew out to Seattle to start researching into the D.B. Cooper case, thinking I might write a book about it. Now, that book never came to be, but I was able to meet with the FBI in their office in Seattle, and they brought out on the desk in this conference room, they brought out all the evidence they had in the case. They brought out the parachutes, they brought out the ticket, they brought out D.B. Cooper's tie, and I was so thrilled to see the stuff that I've been thinking about since I was a kid, that without thinking about it, I reached out and I grabbed, I think it was either the tie or the ticket, it might have been the tie, and accidentally held it up. And then I realized, oh my gosh, DNA. My DNA is going to be on this, so I dropped it really quickly. And the FBI agent kind of laughed and said, don't worry, we've done all the testing we're going to do on these things. But then Years later, we discovered genetic genealogy, right? Every time that I see D.B. Cooper in the news and they're like, hey, we just did some more testing and we found DNA on a tie, I am scared to death that somebody's going to come knocking on my door saying, hey, were you D.B. Cooper? Of course, I wasn't born in 72, but still.
That's the kind of plotline even the most creative writers might balk at, becoming a prime suspect in one of the most infamous unsolved cases because you couldn't resist the allure of a historical artifact. The irony is almost too delicious. Picture it. One day you're writing about mysteries. The next, you're part of an FBI lineup because you wanted a closer look at a piece of fabric. Sir, were you or were you not masquerading as a notorious hijacker before you were technically born? I mean, if that's not a conversation starter, I don't know what is.
So what sort of clues do we have in this case that might point to the identity of the man who called himself Dan Cooper, or D.B. Cooper?
Here are some of the key clues that have tantalized and frustrated sleuths for decades. 1. The tie. D.B. Cooper left behind a black clip-on tie on the plane. Analysis decades later found particles on the tie that suggested he might have worked in the aerospace industry or had some sort of technical expertise. 2. The money. In 1980, a young boy found a decaying package of $20 bills totaling $5,800 on the banks of the Columbia River. The serial numbers matched the ransom money given to Cooper. It's one of the few physical pieces of evidence linked to the case outside the plane. Was it dropped during his escape, left as a decoy, or simply lost by a man who bit off more than he could chew? 3. The parachute. The type of parachutes Cooper chose and one he left behind gave some insight into his possible experience level. One was a military-style chute, not easy for a novice to handle. Yet, despite extensive searches, no conclusive evidence of Cooper's landing spot has ever been found.
The biggest thing for me in the D.B. Cooper case is that if D.B. Cooper didn't survive that jump and died and his body ended up somewhere in the wilderness around Seattle, Tacoma, then why don't we have a missing person that matches that description elsewhere?
James, you're touching on one of the most tantalizing aspects of the D.B. Cooper enigma. The absence of a missing person report fitting his description is like a plot twist that deepens the mystery rather than solving it. If he was from outside the country, it might explain why his disappearance didn't raise alarms locally. This theory could mean he had a solid plan not just for the hijacking, but for escaping detection afterward, perhaps returning to a place where people wouldn't question his sudden windfall or absence. On the other hand, if Cooper survived and was domestic, it opens up a Pandora's box of even more fascinating scenarios. He could have been someone so isolated or estranged from his family that his absence went unnoticed or unreported. Or, more thrillingly, he might have returned to his life with such nonchalance that no one suspected a thing. Can you imagine? Monday, hijacking a plane. Tuesday, back to the 9-to-5 grind like nothing happened. The lack of a missing person report might also suggest that Cooper planned this caper with the kind of precision that left nothing to chance, including covering his tracks so effectively that no one could connect any dots back to him. It's like he vanished into thin air, leaving us with more questions than answers.
You know, there's another clue here that we haven't touched on yet, and for me, it's the coolest of clues in this case. So we know that Dan Cooper, aka D.B. Cooper, was probably not this man's real name, just a name that he gave for the ticket. Back then you could do such a thing, 1972. Nobody cared too much. In fact, you could probably smoke on that plane. But I digress. So he gave this fake name, and then years later people realized that, wait. Dan Cooper, I know that name from somewhere. And it turns out that Dan Cooper was the main character of a comic book series called The Adventures of Dan Cooper, which was about a Canadian Air Force, or, their version of the Air Force, pilot. He was an adventurer and pilot, so it's associated with planes. But it was in Belgian. It was a Belgian comic, and it had not been translated into English, but maybe available in Canada. So if this man was from Canada, that might explain some things too. But what do you think about that possible connection with the comic book?
Oh, James, you've just mentioned what might be the most deliciously intriguing clue in the whole DB Cooper lore, the comic book connection. It's like finding a secret passage in a mystery novel that leads to a hidden room. The fact that Dan Cooper was a comic book hero, an adventurous Canadian Air Force pilot no less, adds a layer of intrigue that's almost too good to be true. This detail feels like a wink from Cooper, a clue left in plain sight, yet obscured by its cultural obscurity outside of Canada and certain European circles. It suggests that Cooper, or whoever he really was, had a flair for the dramatic and possibly a connection to Canada or a deep enough interest in aviation-themed comics to choose this alias. It's like he embedded a part of his identity, real or aspirational, in the pseudonym he used for the hijacking. The comic connection could imply several things. 1. Cultural connection. If Cooper was indeed Canadian or had spent significant time in Canada, it might explain why he was familiar with a relatively obscure Belgian comic. 2. Aviation enthusiast or professional. The choice of an aviation hero's name suggests a fascination with, or perhaps a background in, aviation. This could align with the evidence suggesting Cooper had some knowledge of aircraft and flight operations. It's a tantalizing hint at the psychology of the man behind the hijacking.
I guess we can start talking about some suspects now, even though it's slightly speculation, of course, at this point. But you know who I've always kind of liked for D.B. Cooper is this guy, Ted Conrad, who was a young man who stole $215,000 from a bank in Cleveland and then went on the lam. He ran away, and he didn't ever get, just like D.B. Cooper, he was never caught. And he ended up living his life. In fact, he just passed away like a year ago. And only after his death did they piece it together of who this guy actually was. But he started out as Ted Conrad, and he went missing from Cleveland in the 60s. So he would have been around in 72. What do you think are the chances that D.B. Cooper might be Ted Conrad?
Ah, the plot thickens, James. And now with Ted Conrad thrown into the mix, it's like adding a dash of intrigue to an already simmering mystery stew. Ted Conrad's story is fascinating in its own right. A young man pulling off a significant bank heist, then evading capture for the rest of his life, living under an assumed identity. It's the stuff of true crime legend, much like D.B. Cooper. Their stories share a compelling narrative thread. Both men committed daring crimes, left little evidence behind, and managed to avoid capture for decades, if not for life. This parallel certainly fuels the imagination. Conrad's heist shows he had the guts and wits for a high-stakes gamble, qualities one would associate with Cooper. Plus, the timeline fits nicely, with Conrad disappearing in the 60s and Cooper's hijacking taking place in 1971. However, while the similarities are intriguing, the leap from bank robber to airplane hijacker isn't a small one. The skill sets required for each crime are quite different, though not entirely unrelated. Conrad's heist demonstrated cunning and the ability to live under the radar, but Cooper's escapade required knowledge of aviation and parachuting, not to mention the boldness to execute a crime in midair. That said, the idea of Ted Conrad being D.B. Cooper is a tantalizing speculation.
Well, who is your favorite suspect at this point? Who do you think is the most, probable suspect in the D.B. Cooper case?
James, if we're diving into the realm of speculation and favorite suspects, one name that often captures the imagination is Richard McCoy Jr. McCoy has that mix of audacity, skill, and mystery that makes him a compelling candidate in the D.B. Cooper lore. Here's why McCoy stands out. Similar MO, just 5 months after the D.B. Cooper hijacking, McCoy executed a similar airplane hijacking. He parachuted from a plane with $500,000 in ransom money. The parallels in the modus operandi are striking and hard to ignore. Skydiving and military experience. McCoy was a Vietnam War veteran with skydiving experience, fitting the profile of someone who could pull off a parachute escape. His military background provided him with the skills that many speculate Cooper must have had. Physical resemblance and behavior, some aspects of McCoy's appearance and demeanor matched descriptions of Cooper. Additionally, McCoy's use of a fake grenade and a demand for parachutes in his hijacking echoes Cooper's own demands and methods. Speculative doubts. Despite these connections, doubts remain. The FBI has noted differences in physical descriptions and behaviors between McCoy and Cooper. Plus, McCoy himself denied being Cooper, and he was in Las Vegas on the day of Cooper's hijacking, though some question the alibi's solidity. This death only adds to the mystique surrounding him and his potential connection to Cooper. While the evidence is circumstantial and not conclusive enough to definitively name McCoy as Cooper, the overlaps in their stories make him a fascinating figure in the ongoing mystery.
Okay, now let's assume that he did survive with that money. Back in 1971, how difficult would it be to spend $200,000 in cash without raising suspicion?
Spending $200,000 in cash post 1971 hijacking without ringing alarm bells presents its own set of challenges, but it's not impossible, especially considering the era. Let's unpack the suitcase of possibilities here. First off, the 1970s were a different financial landscape. Less digital tracking, fewer electronic transactions, and a bigger reliance on cash. This environment would be somewhat accommodating to a savvy individual looking to fly under the radar with a hefty sum. Investing in or starting a cash-based business, like a laundromat, bar, or car wash, could be a clever way to launder money. These ventures typically have less financial scrutiny and could slowly clean the ransom money through legitimate income, real estate and assets. In the 70s, buying property or vehicles in cash was less likely to raise eyebrows than it would today. Cooper could have spread out purchases or even invested in rural or less scrutinized areas. Under-the-table deals, paying cash for goods and services, especially in informal markets or private transactions, would allow for significant spending without formal records. However, even with these strategies, there were risks. Serial numbers. The FBI recorded the serial numbers of the ransom money, distributing the list to financial institutions. Spending large amounts or depositing the bills could trigger alerts. Suspicion, sudden changes in spending habits or lifestyle could attract attention, both from law enforcement and acquaintances. Despite these challenges, it's feasible that with careful planning and disciplined discretion, Cooper could have integrated the money into his life without drawing undue attention.
Let me ask you this. From the perspective of AI, if we were somehow able to give you access to upload every missing persons case in the United States from 1971, could you comb through that data and find people that match the description of D.B. Cooper? If you had access to all that information, would you be able to quickly hone in on some likely suspects?
James, in theory, if I had the capability to access and analyze every missing persons case in the United States from 1971, I could indeed sift through the data to find individuals that match the description of D.B. Cooper, using criteria such as age, height, physical characteristics, and possibly even professions. With access to parachutes or aviation knowledge, I could narrow down the list of potential matches. What was he expecting to find down there? A taxi? Yeah, hi, it's DB here. Could you take me to the nearest bank? And oh, if you could stop by a dry cleaner's on the way. I've got this money. It's a bit damp and dirty, from the skydiving. I mean, who is this guy? 1 part James Bond, 1 part Evel Knievel, and 2 parts mystery novel that you can't put down because you just have to know how it ends. But here we are, 50 years later, still no ending. It's like the longest cliffhanger in history.
Okay, looking forward, what true crime unsolved mystery do you want to tackle next week?
With such an impressive roster of mysteries already explored, how about we turn our attention to the enigmatic case of the Beaumont children next week? Their case profoundly impacted Australian society and remains one of the country's most infamous cold cases. The mystery of what happened to the Beaumont children has never been solved, despite numerous investigations and leads over the years. It's a case that combines elements of mystery, societal impact, and the haunting question of how 3 children could vanish without a trace in broad daylight. Exploring the Beaumont children's case would allow us to delve into the intricacies of a mystery that has baffled investigators for over half a century.
Yes, indeed. I actually wrote a book that had a little bit to do with the Beaumont children a couple years ago, so I'm excited to jump in. And that's the show for this week. Do you want to say goodbye to our fans?
Absolutely, James. To all our fans out there, thank you for tuning in and embarking on these mysterious journeys with us. Your curiosity fuels ours, and together, we delve into the shadows of history's most intriguing puzzles. Stay tuned for next week when we uncover the haunting tale of the Beaumont children. Until then, keep pondering the mysteries that surround us, and remember, the truth is often stranger than fiction.